One of the things I like to do is based on my frustration with so much of the lack of seriousness in the world today. So I like to talk to you about stories that I consider some of the biggest stories on planet Earth that no one is really paying attention to. You'll get occasional blips on the media radars. They'll poke up every once in a while, and you'll hear occasional stories about it, but not really. And my job here is one to tell you that there's more going on than politics in the world, although this is somewhat politically related, but also it's some of the most important stories on the planet. And I want you to think about them. If no one else is going to think about them, at least you will think about them. And I will feel like I've done my duty to put on your radar very important things that you should know about that otherwise aren't getting attention. One of the stories that I have been talking about for quite some time is about the Sahel. That's the fancy way of saying the Southern Sahara region of Africa. It stretches across roughly from Mauritania and Senegal all the way across to Eritrea, Djibouti, Ethiopia. The big ones, though, are Mali, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Benin, Burkina Faso. This is, if you look at a map of Africa, you kind of have a vague idea of where the Sahara is the giant desert mass throughout North Africa, and it stretches down. If you call that part of Africa that juts out and around the head of Africa, it goes about halfway down. And then you get into grasslands. The desert gives way to grass, and then the grass gives way to forest, and the forest gives way to jungle. But there is an area there. It is a sandy, arid area of grasslands. It's called the Sahel. And there are some very large countries in that region. Sudan, Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, Senegal. Mali, by the way, if you've ever heard of Timbuktu, Timbuktu is a real place. It used to be a massive kingdom, and Timbuktu is in Mali. Now, this area of the world on the southern end of the Sahara has a lot of issues with poverty and religious conflict. There are Christians and there are Muslims and there are tribal pagan religions that battle it out. There are Muslim terrorists, Islamic terrorists. After the war on terror began with the 9/11 bombings or plane crashes, the Bush administration realized they had to go into Africa and eradicate some terrorist hotspots. Nikki Haley's husband is actually on active duty in Africa right now. One of the things that you don't appreciate because it doesn't get a lot of media coverage is there are massive special forces operations that happen on the African continent. Now, the African continent, for perspective, is massive. You could fit North America and Europe basically inside Africa. It is a massive, massive continent with massively sized, impoverished countries. And Islamic terrorists moved in, and they were given safe haven in some countries, and in some countries they took over. And in a lot of countries, what the United States did is they went into countries and built up the armed forces of those countries, stabilized those countries, and those stable countries provided resistance to the Islamic fighters. And a lot of those countries used to be countries back in the day that were friendly to the Soviet Union. Very wisely, when the Soviet Union fell, George H.W. Bush, then President of the United States, began to push rapidly into African nations with diplomacy and aid spending and military aid. It was maintained by Bill Clinton and by George W. Bush. And the thinking was this: with the Soviets collapsed and these economies dependent on the communists, if we could convert them to become American allies, it would provide stability on the African continent, a continent that had otherwise been in a lot of turmoil. And so despite some isolation and tendencies in the United States, it was money well spent. We did not spend a ton of money. Less than a single percentage point of the American budget goes to foreign aid. And less than that went to these African countries. But in the process, we were able to build up trade ties. We were able to build up military relationships. And we were able to build up a bulkhead against Islamic terror. And we were also able to push aside the Soviet influence in a lot of these places. But there's a problem. And the problem comes in the form of Joe Biden. See, say what you will about Joe Biden, and I've said a lot. The bottom line reality is that the President of the United States is surrounded by people who have embraced critical theory. They have embraced intersectionalism. And because they've embraced critical theory and intersectionalism, they believe that the United States is bad, inherently bad, and that these the countries are colonized countries and we should leave them alone. So the progressive wokes of the Biden administration have walked away from the African countries that we had been building goodwill towards and military relationships with, and guess who's come back to them? The Soviets, now in the form of Vladimir Putin and the Russians. Now, this is also very important because of the push by Western countries to get into batteries. Because guess what the Sahel region has a lot of? Mineral resources needed for batteries. So the wokes who want us all to drive battery-powered vehicles do not want us to have strategic ties to the Sahel region of Africa because we're colonizers and they're colonies. So they've made us get out and allowed the Russians back in. The Russians have partnered with the Islamic radicals to cause problems to the United States to disincentivize our engagement in these African countries. The Russians and the Wagner Group in particular have overturned a lot of these countries in military coups. And now guess what happens? With the head of Wagner killed by Vladimir Putin in that plane crash a while back, and the Wagner Group exiled to the African nations, and many Russians not wanting to go hang out in Africa, the Wagner Group is recruiting the African militaries to become part of the Wagner Group and expand their mercenary capabilities, and also let the Islamic radicals off the chain. If you want to understand where intersectional critical theory gets us, it gets us to this mess in Africa. The wokes and progressives of the Biden administration won't engage with African countries because we're colonizers, and so it's bad for us to do anything with them. They want us to be behind in energy policy and dependent on China for rare earth minerals. So the Chinese and the Russians are buying up the mines and in some cases just taking them over. They're not even buying them. And now we're dependent on China and Russia for our national security and our energy future. And the wokes love that. The wokes love that we're dependent on Russia and China for our energy security. They love that we're dependent on terrorists for our energy security because the colonizer has his comeuppance. And the reality is they've put us behind on our national security. It is genuinely insane what this administration is doing. That, remember PEPFAR. PEPFAR is actually a great program. PEPFAR is a good program that has helped wipe out AIDS in Africa. It was a program that the Bush administration put in place with the support of evangelicals, you should note. It's very funny to watch Republicans turn on PEPFAR because the Democrats have been promoting it, completely ignorant of its history, that PEPFAR was actually a program put forward by the Bush administration with the support of evangelicals that was fought by the Democrats. The Democrats hated the idea of the program, and it turned out the program was radically successful, so much so that the Democrats have been converted to its worthwhile, even if they don't like aspects of it. But because the Democrats now like it, the Republicans are like, well, screw PEPFAR, we should get rid of it. It's one of the wildest role reversals I've ever seen in public policy. Because Democrats now like something Republicans came up with, the Republicans now hate a highly successful program they came up with. But the Democrats hate that the Bush administration and the Trump administration were making inroads with these African nations and building ties with them. They despise it because they view us as colonizers. And because they view us in some way as colonizers, they believe that the programs themselves should be eradicated. And yet they are really good programs that have really helped us stop a spread of terrorism on the African continent. And why do we want to stop the spread of terrorism on the African continent? Well, overwhelmingly, it's Islamic terrorism. And overwhelmingly, what are they using the African continent for? As a training ground to ultimately come here. We use African countries to kill them. We train the African militaries to kill the Islamic terrorists. Our soldiers aren't dying, and we're keeping the fight there instead of here. It's actually money well spent. This is similar to the situation in Ukraine, where we're letting the Ukrainians use our weapons to kill the Russians, so we're not fighting the Russians. Republicans have a problem with that. Well, Democrats have a problem with it in Africa. It's the same ironic thing that we're doing with the strategy in Ukraine, except we're doing with African countries, except the wokes view the Africans as colonized, oppressed people, and we as the colonizer oppressor, so we should abandon them and leave them to the Russians and the Chinese and the Islamic radicals, and we are all going to get killed because of what the intersectional wokes and the Biden foreign policy settings are doing in Africa. They are abandoning a continent to Islamic radicals and Russian mercenaries. We had a strong foothold. And by the way, why Putin is doing this? It's because he believes if he can stir back up Islamic radicalism in Africa, we've got to divert resources from Ukraine and Europe to Africa. He's intentionally provoking Islamic radicalism, not because he likes it. He doesn't like it either. But he knows that they're going to come against us before they come against him, and that us and the Islamic radicals fighting each other ties up our resources so Putin gets a free hand. It's actually a very good chess maneuver on the global board for Putin. For all of you who say you don't want your sons and daughters dying in Ukraine, I just want you to see this landscape. Because your sons and daughters aren't dying in Ukraine. They're being sent to Africa. And what's the Biden administration doing? Allowing the destabilization of Africa by Russia and Islamic radicals, where your kid's not going to die on the battlefield in Russia, but there are growing odds they will in the Sahel of Africa, because the Biden administration decided to let the intersectional wokes set his foreign policy there, and that's meant a retreat from an entire continent. And who's filling the void? China, Russia, and the very Islamic radicals we don't want to be there. Thank you, Joe Biden.